Hello again, and welcome to another video series. Today we are starting our Advanced XPDL series, and somewhat with an oxymoron, we're starting with Basic XPDL Macros. XPDL Macros, now that might sound familiar. Well, we talked about PDL variables and macros back in our Basic PDL videos, so why are we bringing this macro business up again? Well, like PDL, XPDL also has macros. So that is what we're going to be focusing on in the next two videos. So just to refresh your memory, what are macros? Basically, a macro is a rule or pattern that allows us to specify how certain input sequences, or this PDL, should be mapped to output. It's basically a way of just writing down some PDL and saving that work and allowing us to reuse that PDL over and over again. It acts as a template. So for example, if I have a long, really tricky piece of PDL, say something like that, I really don't want to type this over and over again. I should probably save this as a macro. And now I can just call it using the name of that macro. Now we talked about something like this before. This is the variables and macros again back in the PDL section. And this sort of utility is so far very much the same. XPDL macro, or basic XPDL macros, I should say, are essentially equivalent to the old PDL macros that you've learned about already. They're just going to be handled in a different context. So what can a macro store? Well, the basic XPDL macros can store things that we've seen previously. Basic PDL, just regular PDL. Or we can have kind of placeholder PDL. So that A here in phrase A bulb acts as a placeholder for other expressions we would like to call this PDL. So this basic, the basic version, the top, that's what we called a variable previously. The bottom, that's what we previously had just called a macro. These are both referred to as macros in the XPDL sense. And then we can also include some advanced features. So advanced XPDL, which we'll talk about in our next video, will actually capture XPDL elements. So rule blocks, attributes, things like that. So why would we want to use macros in XPDL? Well, for the same reasons we like to use them in regular PDL. We can have reusability. We don't have to write the same expression over and over again. It makes it easier for us to read and understand. And if we need to make corrections or edits these statements, we can do it in just one central location. We don't need to go to each instance of this typed out expression and have to worry about doing everything correctly every single time. Just do it once. So that's the same reason this is PDL. It makes our life much easier. So far it seems like macros in the XPDL sense, though, or at least the basic ones, are just the same thing as PDL variables and macros. So why are we going through all this effort to redefine them? Well, it has something to do with scope. If you're familiar with macros and variables in the PDL sense, you're probably aware that you can access them through the settings window, or if you navigate to something where you write PDL, like the taxonomy node, and you find that little M tab, that'll bring you to the menu to write these old PDL variables and macros, and that's where they're defined. Well, the scope of those rules that you previously defined, it works on the server, the project, or the user profile. Remember that you can define these in any of those locations. So if you define an old PDL macro on the server, then anyone on that server can access that macro, and whenever they can call it, they'll be using that one. And same thing goes for the project. Anyone on that project can see it, and then you have one for your user profile, so only you as a user can have access to those variables. There are two other scopes: the entity itself, and then the rule within the entity. So XPDL macros are defined there. Regular PDL macros are defined in settings windows. XPDL macros are defined within entities or within rules inside an entity extraction node inside of XPDL. So they're defined in different locations. The scope also affects the order in which they will take precedence. So suppose I define a macro called myMacro using the settings window, the project. Then I want to define a new macro called myMacro, but I define that on the entity level. Well, the entity macro will overwrite the old myMacro on the project level, and so it'll use the one with the most narrow scope. So the further down you are in this pyramid towards the tip at the bottom, the more precedence you have in applying it. So this is if you had the macros of the same name. If you have different names, then it doesn't matter. So why use XPDL macros rather than old macros? Well, one, they're easier to export in projects. They come natively as part of the XPDL code itself. If you want to sort of copy and paste as well, it's just you don't have to worry about making sure whoever you're giving this XPDL to also imports the variables all wrapped together in one bundle. So it makes it kind of easier. It's all in one window, so sometimes it's easier to view and edit while you're doing all your XPDL at once. Sometimes I have multiple variables and macros in play, and if I need to edit them quickly as I'm going through, maybe I'm building a project and I don't have everything perfect yet, I'm doing a lot of edits. If I'm in the old PDL environment, I have to kind of close my PDL editor, go to my Windows settings, open that up, edit the PDL inside the macro, close it, go back, and then kind of do that over and over again, and that can be a lot of Windows shifting. Maybe it's just easier just to do it all in the one window. That could just be an ease of life thing. So you have that option. And so maybe you want to use an XPDL macro instead of an old PDL macro. Another reason to use XPDL macros is they can just do things that the old macros can't. And we won't talk about that today. We'll get that in our next video. But just keep in mind that they will have some more advanced functionality. So sometimes you just have to use an XPDL macro. It's not just a quality of life or a convenience thing. You literally, for some functionalities, you have to use them. So, big takeaway, like I said, some quality of life things in macros. Another thing would be that prioritization. They are the most prioritized in macros. So if you want them, if maybe you're working on a server that has tons of macros floating around, and you're not sure what's going on there, because a lot of people are working on similar tasks. Well, if you want to be sure you're not using someone else's macro that you don't really have confidence in, or you don't know what it's doing, define them locally in XPDL. That'll have the highest priority. Alright, so how do you make them? That's the most important thing here. How do you actually use them? So unlike the old macros, you don't have some other window to go to and you write it all and you have different little windows in there. You put your PDL and your name and your attribute. You don't do that. You define it very similar to the way you define other things in XPDL, like your PDL queries or your rules. You first need to tell inside your XPDL editor, inside your entity extraction node, first need to declare it. You first need to declare what you're doing. So, like rule : or query : you need to say macro : that tells the XPDL you're defining a macro. And then you need to give the macro a name. So we'll call this one macro name. We'll close parentheses that defines it as kind of a function. And then we'll need to provide it a XPDL query that we're actually using to store this. This is kind of similar to the query block definition, except we're just giving it a name, like macro name. So for example, we can say macro colon like dict for dictionary, and then they're defining some PDL, so or and, so warn or streaking or screeching. This is kind of defining some dictionary of words that we care about. So now it's defined. How do we actually use this in our XPDL? So if you like to use this in part of a PDL query, like phrase, so you can just use phrase, the macro function, and then we provide the name of that function. So the name was like dict for dictionary, so we'll give that a name, and then now. So this will find like warn handle, streaking windows, screeching bolts, things like that. So it's very simple to define, and this is kind of similar to that variable concept we had previously. So again, kind of why do we want to use them? They sound kind of maybe on first impression just like bad versions of hierarchical rules. If you aren't familiar with hierarchical rules, go back to a few of our XPDL videos where we talked about those. Hierarchical rules is just a way of organizing our XPDL, adding filtering, and they kind of act a similar way. We use a named group in a previous parent rule to store some information, and then we call it later. Why not just do a parent rule and a named group to store something we would store in a macro? Why define a macro? What's the point of that? Well, remember that the parent rule should do the following. They should be fast. They won't always be lightning fast, but we should prioritize some speed in our parent rules because they're going to be acting as filters, right? We want to use them to quickly narrow down components of our larger query. And so if they're really time-consuming, it's not efficient. They should be really filtering down and really easy to run. That makes them better. So they should be fast. So if I'm looking for a big query like this, phrase, active principal, admitting primary, then problem or diagnosis. If I'm looking for this all together, it'd be slower than if I just look for these words separately, and then in a child we'll combine them in a phrase function. So they should kind of be looking for individual words. Phrase isn't too time-consuming versus dnode, for example. So if you want to use dnode, consider using maybe phrase first, and then before phrase, individual words. But the point here is that parent rules should be focused on this really fast process. Another thing they should do is through filtering. That's kind of also part of that point. They should eliminate these unneeded documents. They should be very efficient in doing so. So the parent rules should be very good at eliminating things that we definitely don't need to consider in our subsequent rules. They should be very good at getting rid of all the junk we don't want. So in this case, phrase, active, principal, admitting, primary, and then following problem or diagnosis. If we're looking at medical text, that's not going to be a very good parent rule again, because that's probably going to be appearing in a lot of our documents. Principal, diagnosis, active, problem. It's a very generic and common phrase in a medical document. So it's probably not going to be something we want to filter on, because it's not going to roll out in many documents. Finally, a thing that we'd like to do with parent rules is assign these named groups so that our later queries are going to be relying on the saved positions these named groups and not actually running any new queries. This will allow our later queries to be very fast. So you want to find these useful pieces of text, save them as named groups. That way we can use them again later. So parent rules should do all of these things. So macros don't bookmark our queries. They don't save the positions of things. They don't do any filtering. They don't do any of the nice things that hierarchical rules do. So again, why would we use them? So we use hierarchical rules for all the nice things, saving positions, filtering. Macros are useful for pieces of PDL that don't really change much. They're very repetitive. We're going to be using them a lot because we need them to identify certain pieces of information. But they won't really work well as a filter because they're common things, like their numbers, their measurements, for example, their frequent terms. So they're things that you want to condense in a very simple format and to reuse code because we're going to be using that a lot in our queries. But they're not suitable candidates for a hierarchical rule. We could technically make a hierarchical rule out of them and skip the macro business. But it would just add another rule, and it might make our XPDL kind of too many branches going off in it, and it might just be better just to put it in a simple container called a macro. So it's up to you in that case. But so kind of a table breaking down what these things can do. Hierarchical rules are probably, if you can use them and in their benefit, you should use them. So they're very useful for saving repetitive queries. Query macros can do the same thing. They save these repetitive nature of PDL. But hierarchical rules filter documents where query macros can't. Hierarchical rules save positions while query macros don't. You can save a complete PDL query in both. There's sort of different ways of doing that. The hierarchical rules actually save the locations into name groups, but macros just copy and paste PDL. They don't actually save the positions, so you gotta remember that. However, hierarchical rules can't use insertable arguments. That's something a query macro can do. That's one advantage of the query macro so far. Hierarchical rules don't execute each time they're called, which is good. However, query macros do. So if you want to be filtering and saving information for later use, use a hierarchical rule. If you want to just save this repetitive thing that's not going to be a good filter, maybe it's your last piece of your XPDL, it's just some repetitive nature, it doesn't make a good hierarchical rule and you don't want to kick a rule for it, use a query macro. If you're using it with an insertable argument, definitely use a query macro. So here's kind of an example. We've got some XPDL here. So the rule we have is conditions of interest, and we're using a filter rule. We're first looking for some things we found in some word classes: amputation, respiratory failure, anemia. We're using this parent rule just to search our text for these words. And if they're not present, we can ignore them. We can just ignore the document and move on, because if they don't contain these words, then they don't contain the relationships we care about. So once we've found these words, we can move on to the second rule, which looks for the amputation status. So here's where we use that macro. We use phrase, we call the macro, and then we look for amputation. So that macro was that active problem or principal diagnosis. And we stored that in a macro and called it here. And we could have used this as a hierarchical rule. So we could have the first rule, conditions of interest. The next rule would have been current status. And then finally, our third rule would be the amputation status. But that kind of just adds an unnecessary rule in there. It might make it hard to read. There's kind of too many layers going on here. Instead, we just store this in the macro at the top and then reuse it at the bottom. There's not this layered notion going on anymore. So that might just be a personal preference of yours. If you like it in the layered rule-based system, then by all means, go ahead and use that. There's no harm in doing so. It just might not be useful for everybody. In that case, it might not be everyone's preference. So we didn't want to use current status as a hierarchical rule because it just wouldn't filter. We used a macro for it because it's just a simple expression. It's probably going to be appearing in every document, so we just store that in a macro and called it down here. Now you'll notice that I defined this macro at the top before I defined any rules. So that means any rule in our XPDL can call this macro. But if I defined it somewhere else, I could have defined this inside of a rule. And if I define it inside of a rule, then this macro is only going to be able to be used inside of that rule and all of the children of that rule. So in this case, we're still able to call this macro current status in the amputation status rule. But say outside of rule conditions of interest, we defined another rule called conditions of interest 2, for example, and then we had a term, respiratory failure in that one, and then we went on to do respiratory status and did phrase for macro current status, and so forth. But that would fail because the macro current status, it wouldn't know what you're talking about. Macro current status is defined here in the conditions of interest. It's not defined in our other rule. So you have to be careful where you choose to define your macros. You define them outside of rules, that just means globally referenceable. But if you define them inside of a rule, only that rule and its children. So we've seen some query macros. We have a complete query here. Just another thing we can use is a macro with an argument. We kind of referred to this earlier. This is where you cannot use a hierarchical rule. You have to use a macro. So we have a partial query with some insertable arguments. This is kind of similar to what we refer to as just macros in the basic PDL section. So if you wanted to use something like this, you define it just like you would a normal macro. You would call it macro, macro name, and then inside the parentheses, you give the arguments you want to define as your placeholders. So for example, macro collision, I define party 1 and party 2 as my arguments, and then my PDL query will be phrase 3, party 1, term, collide, party 2. And there you go. It's pretty easy. To actually use this, all you gotta do is call it by saying macro, give it the name, and then I fill in the arguments that I'm using. So maybe insured, claimant. So here's an example where we would like to do that. So we have a big PDL query with an insertable argument called medical condition. Okay, like this. So what this is looking for is it's making sure that the medical condition is not being negated by something, like say the patient denies, or no report of headache, for example. And so this PDL query, we want it to be macro of, because for every condition, headache, anemia, or respiratory failure, bleeding, all these different things, we want to have this filter sort of logic on. And we don't want to type that each time. So we'll create a macro with an insertable argument, and be able to use that. So this is something we cannot do with our hierarchical rules, and so we need to use this query macro. So when you use a query macro in this case, you probably want to use as many parent rules as you can before where you actually call it. It'll make it run faster. It'll have the most filtering, and then you have the most named groups already defined and found for you, so you can reuse those. So in this case, we can find things like cardiac arrest, patient has a history of high blood pressure, but where it's negated, we will not match this query. So it's good. So that wraps up our basic summary of XPDL macros. So far, they're very similar to our old macros, just defined in a new scope and a new location. In the next video, we'll talk about advanced XPDL macros. This will add new functionality to our macros, allowing us to capture the actual pieces of XPDL inside the macro itself. So stay tuned for that video. Take care.